to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll focus first on some pins and then on passed pawns. Well, let's get started. Here we go. In this position, black already is a pawn up and is threatening a second pawn on b4. White here made a serious mistake by trying to protect that pawn indirectly by playing rook e3. You may wonder, but how does this move protect the b4 pawn? Well, it doesn't directly, but if black would now still capture the pawn, they'd regret that because the knight would be falling on e5. And of course, as we know, a knight is a lot more valuable, worth 3 points compared to a pawn. The problem is that after white plays rook to e3, the white bishop on c1 is no longer guarding the knight on g5. So what that means is that now black can make a little combination and give up the rook for the knight because the pawn on h4 is in a pin, meaning that when the pawn captures, black captures a rook, and black gave up a rook but gained a knight and a rook. So while in the starting position black was only up a pawn, now black is up a knight and a pawn. Of course, if in the position after rook e3 and rook takes g5, the white pawn does not capture the rook, but the white king moves out of the check, then also black would have won a knight without exchanging the rooks on the h file. Let's move on to our next example. In this position, white already is doing very well, and the white bishop could certainly capture black's rook on g7, winning an exchange and leaving white in a completely winning position. However, white can do even better by forcing checkmate in just 2 moves. Can you think of the first move? Well, the good news is white actually has several choices that accomplish the same goal. The important part is to discover the pattern that makes it work. It's a forced checkmate in just 2 moves. So what white needs to do is, white needs to create a discovery, a discovered check. By retreating the bishop, for example to e3, it opens up the h-file for the rook to check black's king. The king has only one move, moving to g6, and now the simple but beautiful checkmate with the rook arrives on h6. One of those situations when you see a good move, look around, you may have an even better one. And now let's move on to our next example. Here we are. In this position, let's see what's going on. First of all, the white knight on f5 is under attack. So the first thing you would think of, where to move that knight. However, before you conclude that you must move that knight, look around and see what else is going on in the position. I have to tell you, there is something unusual going on in this case. Namely, that the black queen is in a very awkward position on a3, surrounded by all enemy pieces. Moreover, we can see that if that queen would be attacked, it would have no place to go. So therefore, let's see if there is a way to win that queen for no compensation or not sufficient compensation for black. As we know, the queen is worth 9 points, so as long as we need to give up less than 9 points, it's a good idea to give up a piece or two and get the opponent's queen. In this case, the correct solution is just like in our previous example that involved discovery. So here what white needs to do is move the knight to c1. By doing so, all of a sudden, the white rook opened up on the a file, threatening the black queen. Of course, we must notice that by moving the knight away from a2 to c1, now the b4 square is no longer guarded by white's knight. But white doesn't mind that at all, because even from b4, it's a new scenario. The queen is no longer on a3, but on b4, or from b4, the queen still does not have any safe squares to go to. So again, all white needs to do is to attack the queen, and the queen may be trapped. Of course, it matters quite a bit how and from where do we attack the black queen. For example, if now the white knight would move back to a2, that would be no more than repetition of moves. The queen would come back to a3 again. So that wouldn't bring our boat forward. So let's go back to this position and look for other ways to attack the queen. That same knight can try to go to d3 also, which would be a poor choice, because even though the queen has no safe square to go to, black would simply trade off his bishop, which is of equal value to the knight, and then the second knight would be also hanging on f5. So this again would not be the correct way to go. The right way to go is to attack the queen with the pawn. And in fact, generally speaking, when you can try to trap a piece, try to use the lowest value piece that you can accomplish the goal with. The reason behind that theory is that almost always when a piece attacks a higher value piece, that piece is able to capture the lower value piece. So therefore, it's much better for you to try to give up, let's say, a pawn for a queen than it would be attacking the queen with a rook and give up a rook for a queen. Of course, if you don't have a choice, you should be happy to give up your rook for a queen. But if you do have a choice, multiple ways to attack the enemy queen or another piece, try to use the lowest valued piece among your choices. Of course, assuming that all of them still accomplish the goal in trapping the piece, like in this case, trapping the queen. The actual game continued here, black trying to get the most for his queen by capturing the rook, but nevertheless white comes out ahead after bishop captures queen, and even that black gets to capture the knight, black is faced by further trouble after pawn captures back. Now the black rook is under attack by the pawn, black traded with a check, queen captured back, and now the problem is that the knight is under attack from the white bishop in the corner. Black played bishop to g7, protecting the knight, and now came another problem. The white queen appeared on h4, attacking the knight a second time. Of course, white would capture the knight with the bishop first, not with the queen, and the black actually is in major trouble because they cannot save the knight. If the knight would move, then all of a sudden the queen could grab the rook on d8, and black is losing further material. Let's move on to the next example. And now we're moving on to the examples that involve promoting a passed pawn. Let's look at this scenario here. What's going on? At first it seems that white is in major trouble being down a bishop and a pawn. It's true that white could win a pawn back right away by capturing black's pawn on g6 and furthering his own pawn, getting it closer to a promotion square. The problem is that black will simply play d4, and with that opening the bishop's diagonal to hold off white's g pawns. This is a check, and then after king takes pawn, the black king could simply go after the white g pawns. After g7, grab the pawn on g5, and the bishop is doing its job by getting ready to capture white's queen if the pawn chooses to promote. So let's go back again to the beginning and look at other options. For example, if white advances the f pawn to f6, now the pawn is about to cross through a light square that the black bishop, could control, but it's just a tempo too slow, because again, just like in the previous variation, black would open up the diagonal, making sure that the bishop from a2 is now guarding the advancement of the white f pawn, and again after king takes, king f4, and the white pawns will slowly but surely fall off one after another, and black will win the game easily. So let's go back one more time, and amazingly white is still able to win this game. The key move here is preventing the opponent's plan, and by moving our own king to d4. That's the only way to win, but it does the job. It prevents the opportunity of black of advancing the d pawn, and as we saw, it was so important for the black bishop from a2 to get control of a light square that would be on the way to promoting white's pawn. Now the trouble for black is, of course, the black king being behind the white pawns makes it impossible for the king to catch that passed pawn. And finally, let's see what happens if black captures the pawn on f5. Then the g pawn will run away, and black's pawn is a bit too slow because white promotes first, and not only promotes but promotes to a queen with a check. And when the king moves away, now this is a tricky moment. White has to be very careful not to play king e3 right away, going after the black pawn on f3, which would allow the discovery of the bishop with d4 check, and then capturing white's queen. White is busy with the check, therefore the queen has no time to move away, and wherever the white king moves out of the check, the white queen will be lost. Therefore, it's really important to first give a couple checks with the queen, put the queen in a safe place, and now the king can easily move to e3 without any danger of losing the queen. A very important lesson that you constantly must think of the opponent's threats and plans as well, not just of your own. We saw in this example that by trying to advance our own pawn right away to promote our passed pawn, it would have been a big mistake, because it would have allowed black to open up the defensive diagonal of the bishop and save the game or even win the game. On the other hand, if we first prevent the opponent's plan and then follow up with our own, it worked beautifully and white is winning. Let's move on to our next example that will also focus on similar topic on how to promote a passed pawn or how to create one. And here is the next example, which is a very simple looking knight endgame. Most knight endgames with even number of pawns typically end up in a draw. And it is quite surprising that in this position, white actually has a way to win. Pretty amazingly, white can start immediately with a combination to create a passed pawn. By sacrificing the knight on g7, white voluntarily is trying to give up his knight. If now the black knight captures the white knight on g7, then the white pawn will be ready to move forward, and quite amazing, but even though it's black to move and the white pawn is still 2 squares away from the promotion square, black cannot get to any of the squares which would hold off the white pawn. The white pawn is unstoppable. Of course, if we go back to the starting position, it's clear that if black foresees that after knight takes knight, white's h-pawn will be unstoppable, black is much better off playing knight f8 and rather give up a pawn and try to survive in this endgame. Because now at least the h-pawn doesn't run away immediately. So white will certainly need to make a lot more effort to make progress. But the end of the story is white won a pawn, and that was the task in this example. And let's move on. Here we are. This is a very critical position where white has a far advanced passed pawn, but one of those things that either that pawn will become the hero of the game, will get promoted, or it will get lost. We can see how both black rooks are already aiming at that pawn. And as we know, in one move it's very rare that we could protect a piece with 2 pieces at the same time, while only moving one. And this is no exception. White certainly has no way whatsoever in protecting the c7 pawn twice. Obviously, white could move his rook to c5, but that would protect the pawn only once, allowing black to safely capture white's pawn on c7. And then black would be just completely fine. The point here is that white has a very tricky way of winning the game. Look at this. It looks almost like magic. First, play rook d8, check, leaving black with a single choice. Rook takes rook. And now, not capturing the black rook and promoting the pawn, because then the result would have been pretty much the same, losing the pawn. But here comes the big important point: sacrificing the second rook as well. A very important move. White is giving up 2 rooks, but now it is white's turn. Capture 1 rook and promote the pawn. So at the end result, instead of having 2 rooks each, white now has a queen versus rook, which is of course a humongous advantage and generally sufficient to win. Let me show you just one more thing to demonstrate that it's not the same in which order you give up the rooks. If white would choose first to give up the rook on the f-file and then come to d8, it seems almost good. If black now would capture the white rook, then indeed the c-pawn would capture back, and we would reach exactly the same scenario as we've seen in the correct solution. However, the big difference is that now black would have the option in blocking the check with rook e8, and then both rooks are well protected for black, and black will win easily, being a rook ahead. A very nice example on how to promote your passed pawn. Let's move on. Here we are. In this position, it is black who has a far advanced pawn, but at the moment white is a piece ahead. Moreover, white is threatening to checkmate in 2 moves, starting with queen takes pawn on g6. Therefore, playing rook e1 right away, which is the natural looking move, checking the king, and then if rook takes rook, the black pawn captures back with promoting to a queen and check, and white gets checkmated. The problem is that after king c2, black now has no time to capture the white rook, because then it is white who will give the checkmate in just 2 moves. So this doesn't quite work out. So look at this beautiful idea. Black is willing to even give up his most valuable piece, the queen. Because now, after queen f1 check, queen f1, the black rook comes down to fork. If king moves out of the check, then black simply captures the queen on f1, or alternatively, if queen takes rook, then the pawn gets promoted to a queen, and the game is easily won for black. So let's go back again to this position, and again, very important, you always be aware of the opponent's threats, because if you didn't pay attention, you didn't search for the opponent's threat, which is queen takes pawn on g6, the natural move rook e1 looks very good. But if you noticed the threat, then you would search for an improvement and hopefully find the correct way of accomplishing the goal, which is in this case to promote the f-pawn. Very nice example. And let's see our final example in this lesson. In this example, it is white's turn. Black has just offered to trade queens on e3, and it seems that white needs to react to that. The white queen is under attack, and white should decide either to trade or move the queen away from the attack. Well, let's start with those options. If right now white indeed trades queens and then pushes the pawn, the problem is the black rook will come right behind white's pawn and hold it off. Let's go back to the beginning and let's see what would happen if right now white would protect his queen. Then again the problem would be that black would trade queens, and the black rook would get the opportunity to come down to e1, checking white's king and winning the bishop, which needs to give itself up. And yet there is a way for white to win the game. White can and should advance the pawn to d7. So the correct answer is to play d7 and ignore the threat to the queen, because if now black captures the queen indeed, then the pawn gets to promote, capture black's rook, promote the pawn to a queen, and checkmate all at once. And alternatively, if after d7 black would try to move the rook, then the queen on e3 is hanging. So black is in a no-win situation, will either have to give up the rook or the queen, and of course that's not a pleasant choice. I hope you learned some new things in this lesson relating to how dangerous pass pawns are and some tricks on how to make them promote in situations that it seems difficult. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Bye-bye.